Missing someone. Missing someone. Missing someone. Love with all your heart. Missing someone.
This is why you have to be careful who you let into your Halloween parties. So this is a photo of who police believed was a guest at a Halloween party in Rochester, New York in the 1940s. The party was being thrown by Jack and Amelia Layton, and they actually noticed that this guest was outside of the party watching the guests through a window. The report claims that Amelia believed the guest was her friend Jan, who tended to go above and beyond for Halloween, creating very scary costumes. So she let this person in believing it was her friend Jan. But then 20 minutes later, Jan shows up, and that guest could not be found anywhere. So Amelia starts running around the party asking everyone if they knew who that guest was, and no one had recognized that person. So she goes into her daughter's room, who was playing while the party was happening. And the police report states that the only thing there left of Amelia's daughter was a bloody shoe. 4 other reports of this guest being at parties that night were called into police, and all of them resulted in missing children's cases. The identity of this person has never been found, and none of the kids have been found.
If you're going trick-or-treating tomorrow, you need to be careful, and here's why. This was around 5 years ago. Me and 5 other friends went to go trick-or-treating in our neighborhood. Everything was good, the night was going great, and we were getting candy. Until maybe about 11 p.m. That's when people started to go home and the sidewalks were empty. We were the only ones there. I started to get scared and wanted to go home, but my friends insisted that we stayed out and get more candy. I agreed and we carried on. About 30 minutes later, we see someone walking the streets. They're dressed really weird, but we don't think anything of it because it is Halloween after all. We walk past them and they don't look at us, which is weird, but we just keep minding our business. A few blocks later, we see the same person. We started to get worried. What if he's following us? I said. You're just paranoid. He's probably just trying to get candy like us. She tried to reassure me, but I was still skeptical. Yeah, okay, but if we see him again, I'm going home. We walk a few more blocks and we don't see the guy. All of a sudden, we hear a car coming our way. The car was black and slowly creeping down the roads. I can't take this anymore. I want to go home. Fine, you can go home, but we're staying out. I run all the way home, not looking back. An hour passed, and I kept looking at my phone. They didn't text or call me. I thought they were just mad at me, so I went to sleep. The next day, no texts or no calls. I was getting worried, and I decided to tell my parents. They called each of my friends' parents. They all said they were home and safe, but one. The girl that kept insisting to stay out did not return home. Turns out, she was murdered.
Heard your name being called by somebody that you know, and when you reply or go see what they want, that person is not there. So usually whenever you hear your name being called and nobody is there, that is a spirit trying to trick you. That spirit is wanting you to answer back because that's how you invite it in. At my previous job, I worked at a retail store, and I swear I heard my manager call my name. And the main rule is that if you ever hear your name being called, you ignore it and do not answer. Well, I seriously thought my manager was calling my name, so I answered yes. Then there was no reply. I called out to my manager and there was still no reply. Being confused, I decided to walk around and look for him, and that's when I realized he was not there. In reality, nobody was there around me. And my husband also experienced this chilling phenomenon. My husband stated that inside of his old home, he was upstairs by himself when he heard his mom calling his name. My husband replied saying yes, and that voice still called his name. He decided to go downstairs because he truly thought his mom was calling him, and that's when he realized he was home alone. Nobody was inside that home besides him. And I have one last story for you guys. I truly believe that my husband's friend, we'll just call him Jay, his parents live in a haunted house. But about that house, I can honestly do a whole separate video about it because I've experienced something as well as my husband. So one night, me, my husband, and our friend Jay were actually out playing pool when Jay got a call from his aunt. She asked Jay, "Hey, is Brian here?" And that's when Jay replied, "No, we're all playing pool. Why?" And what Jay's aunt replied honestly gave me the chills. She stated that she heard Brian, my husband, and Jay talking in one of the rooms upstairs. That it sounded like my husband's voice, but with a deeper, anonymous tone. That's why if you ever hear your name being called, never answer it and make sure that the person that's actually calling you is truly there. Because once you answer them, you are ultimately inviting them into your space.
Let this be a reminder that there really are monsters out there. In 2007, a woman living right near a prison in California got home late one night and went right to bed. Around midnight, she woke up to footsteps on her first floor, assumed it was her roommate, so she goes downstairs to say hi. She yells out to her roommate, who doesn't say anything, and then in walks this giant man who she doesn't recognize. She runs upstairs, jumps in her closet into the crawl space, and hides. As she's helplessly tucked away in this little crawl space, trying not to make any sound, all she hears is this giant man sprinting around her house, running into walls, flipping furniture, and screaming in frustration because he can't find her. Finally, after several hours, she slowly opens the crawl space back up, crawls out, and gets her phone off the nightstand and calls police. As she's telling the police her story, she describes the person who had broken in, and they stop her and say, "Ma'am, go back in the crawl space and stay there. We'll be there as soon as we can." If you're alone right now, don't watch this video. In the winter of 2018, a man who was living alone in the mountains wakes up to find a red ball sitting on his front yard. He assumed the only neighbor he had must have kids, and so he kicks the ball over the fence, goes inside, doesn't think anything of it. That night, he wakes up to the sound of kids laughing outside of his window. He goes outside to check on them because it's the middle of the night, and there's no kids anywhere, but that red ball is back on his property. So he picks it up, brings it in his house, and goes back to bed. The next morning, he goes over to his neighbor's house to let them know that their kids were out in his yard in the middle of the night. But it turns out his neighbor is just some old man who lives alone, and there aren't any kids anywhere in the area. That night he wakes up again to the sound of kids on his property, and when he looks outside, there's no kids, but that red ball is back on his property. Panicked, he runs downstairs to make sure the one he brought in is still inside, and it's gone. He checked every window and door, and everything was still locked. It didn't make any sense. He decides to look out the window one more time, and off in the distance is some weird stiff figure watching him.
So I asked my mom if there was anything really creepy I did when I was younger. And she said when I was 4 or 5, I always said I worked for the devil. And that I would torture and abuse my sister and always blame it on the devil. I do remember taking her stuffed animals, cutting them in half, throwing them in a closet and locking her in the closet with them. And I'd leave her in there for fucking hours. Just her screaming and crying, let me out. And I'd always say, no, the devil wants me to keep you in there longer. I would even rip out her hair, and my mom would be like, hey, you can't fucking do that. That's literal abuse. And I would always say, well, the devil wants me to. By the way, I was 4 or 5. The behavior did stop when we moved out of that house. I don't know what age I was, but when we moved out, I was fine. But it only gets worse.